Now, we're looking, or I'm looking specifically north, back towards Frederick. And what's important to remember is today Frederick City comes up pretty much to the very edges of our 1,600 and almost 1,650 acres that is Monocacy National Battlefield. But in 1864, there's a good 2 miles, almost 3 miles between Monocacy Junction down here and the city proper. Okay, so there was a lot of space, a lot of farmland between what is now the battlefield and the city at the time. What we're on is the Best Farm. And Best Farm in 1864 is going to be David Best and his wife, and his father actually lives just a little further to the north of us, pretty much where the mall is today, the FSK Mall. Now, we would see on the morning of July 9th, 1864, Confederate forces moving southward, pushing towards us. And as we'd stated during the introduction, the vast majority of Federal troops are to the south of us on the opposite side of the Monocacy River. But there was a thin line of Union skirmishers on this side of the river, north of the river still. In fact, that gravel road that we came in on, that's about where the first line of Federal resistance will be. 300 men, a mixed command from elements of the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, the 9th New York Heavy Artillery, the 106th New York Infantry, and actually I believe that's it right there. So about 300 soldiers of this mixed command. They're under the command of Captain Brown of the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. And all that morning he is seeing dust moving towards him. He is getting reports from his scouts of columns coming down the Georgetown Pike. And he begins to get calls from his men. Sir, can we fire? Can we fire, sir? And he keeps telling them no, no. He's really hoping that these troops moving down from Frederick are reinforcements. Maybe David Hunter's troops have finally arrived. It wouldn't be until his own men come under fire from the advance of the Confederate forces that Captain Brown realizes what's actually coming towards him. He is also going to recognize that he is out of his depth, and he is going to turn over command of this skirmish line, again about 300 men, to a young lieutenant, George Davis, of the 10th Vermont Infantry. That was the other regiment I was trying to think of. The 10th Vermont Infantry has about 75 guys in this skirmish line, and Lieutenant Davis is now in command of the whole line. Over the course of the morning, his forces are slowly going to give ground, falling back towards us, falling over this open countryside behind you guys. In fact, what would have been on these fields in 1864 is a lot of wheat. We do have some corn. It's almost all corn right now, but it's mostly wheat out here in 1864 on this particular farm. We are seeing a lot of grain crops on our various farms as we go through the battlefield today, and on Best Farm we've got a heavy amount of wheat. Now, there's also something here that's missing, a couple of things that are missing. First off, there would have been more woods actually over in the corner of the field up here. There was a woodlot in 1864. But right behind you guys, this open piece of ground, there's actually a barn there in 1864. And as Confederate forces are slowly pushing back the Union skirmishers, those Union skirmishers are going to fall back behind me into the railroad cut of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And Confederate skirmishers and sharpshooters are going to take advantage of this by getting into that barn. In fact, they're going to become quite annoying to Union artillerymen back behind us on the opposite side of the Monocacy River. One of those artillerymen later wrote that with all this incoming fire, they were trying to figure out where the shots were coming from until finally one of their officers saw puffs of smoke coming out from underneath the tiles of this barn. He later said that they trained their guns on the barn, and the third and fourth shot burst within it, and soon the barn was in flames. And we had the pleasure of seeing them, meaning the sharpshooters, being carried away on a litter. That barn will be consumed by the flames and is lost during the Battle of Monocacy. We're going to actually see quite a bit of property destruction here on this battlefield as the fight continues. Now, with Federal forces falling back into the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut here, the Confederate attackers are being delayed. They're not able to get down here to the bridges. They're not able to get south across the Monocacy River. And this is taking a lot of time. But while all this has been going on throughout the morning of July 9th, where's Jubal Early? Because he's not on the battlefield, the Confederate commander. He's back in Frederick, ransoming the town. This will be the third city that Early is going to ransom during the Monocacy campaign, and he would demand $200,000 of the citizens of Frederick. $200,000 in 1864 money is about $3.6 million today. And very understandably, Mayor William Cole and the city fathers didn't want to pay that. And so they've been buying for time. They've been delaying throughout the morning. They'd heard those Union reinforcements arriving throughout July 8th and into the early morning hours of July 9th. Their hope is, well, if maybe Wallace can win, the city won't have to pay. And so they've been negotiating and delaying throughout the morning of July 9th. In fact, frustrating Early so much that he is going to turn over these negotiations to his staff officers and come out here to the battlefield somewhere between 11:30 in the morning and noon. Well, the negotiations would continue, but by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the citizens of Frederick realize that the game is up, and they're going to get together with 5 different banks to come up with this $200,000. And the story goes is that they delivered the money in large wicker baskets to these Confederate officers, and then the Confederates, they go on a bit of a spree. They get themselves a nice lunch, have some champagne with that lunch, even a little ice cream to finish off the meal. So some delicacies they hadn't had in a while. But before that happens, Early has come out here to the battlefield, and he later wrote in his memoirs that by the time he arrived, his commanders on the ground had already solved the problem for him, is the term he used. Because John McCausland, the Confederate cavalry commander, has begun to look at other ways to get across the Monocacy River. And about a mile to the west of us, he has found a ford, a natural low spot with a hard bottom in the Monocacy that will allow his forces to get across. That is the Worthington-McKinney Ford. And he's going to begin to cross that ford at just around noon. Excuse me. Now, this movement is not going to go unnoticed. In fact, General Wallace comments on it in his after-action report, referring to the contemptuous waving of guidons off to his left. In other words, he could see their flags. And so he is going to call upon his veteran troops, his soldiers from General Ricketts' division, to turn and face this new threat as they're getting south of the Monocacy River. General Wallace is also going to order around noon the wooden-covered bridge on the Monocacy to be burned, denying that crossing point to the Confederates. And the vast majority of George Davis's skirmish line is withdrawn at that point to the opposite side of the river. Most of them, because the 75 men of the 10th Vermont Infantry suddenly realize their escape route is on fire. They will fall back to the Iron Railroad Bridge and continue to guard that for much of the rest of the battle. And we'll hear what happens to them a little later on. But we now have Confederate forces crossing the Monocacy River about a mile to the west of us. They have gotten onto, or what they believe they've gotten onto, is the Federal flank. And we're going to move on from here to find out what happens from there in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to bring you guys over in front of the house as well, talk a little bit about the social history on this battlefield. Well, this particular one, it's possible. Most of our witness trees are marked with little discs. I don't remember if there's one in this tree. You will see some massive sycamores when we get down near the Thomas farm. Those are marked. Those are witness trees. Now, one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about is a little bit of the social history of this landscape as well, beyond just the fight. because the Battle of Monocacy is a one-day engagement. It's about 8 hours, full day's fighting, but the history here at Monocacy National Battlefield is much deeper and much longer than this one engagement. So this farm is originally known as La Hermitage. Now, it was built in 1794 by the Vincentiaire family. And the Vincentiaires had actually fled 2 revolutions. They had fled the Haitian Revolution down in Haiti in 1791, and half the family had fallen back to France, where they had originally been from. But France was in the turmoils of its own revolution at the time, and so they then had to flee the French Revolution. And the Vincentiaires will come to Baltimore and move into central Maryland. Now, we believe that once they moved to central Maryland, they then began to try to rebuild the plantation society they had had in Haiti. They built not only for themselves a large house, and if we look at the front of the house here, this is actually the oldest section right here. These 4 windows are an addition, and stretching back to the west are further additions, but this is the original section of the house right here. We believe that not only did they build themselves this large home, but they began to rebuild the social structure of what they had had in Haiti as well, which meant slaves. And sadly, lots of them. Upwards to 90 enslaved individuals would be on this farm by 1800, for the 1800 census. Most of them being kept out in a number of slave dwellings right out here in the midst of this field. Can everybody see how we've got cornfield out close to the road, a cornfield immediately in our front, and then this large open section in the middle? That open section is where we're going to have about 6 dwellings for enslaved individuals. And again, about 90 people would be in those dwellings for the early 19th century. Now, the Vincentiaires are going to actually be known for their cruelty, unfortunately, to their enslaved. And the size of the population doesn't make a lot of sense. The farm is very large. It's over 750 acres. But we believe the reason that they have this large number of enslaved is actually not only for their own farm, but also to rent them out and lease them out. There's a lot of industrial slavery in this part of Maryland, particularly on the Catoctin Mountains, with both logging and iron ore mining going on at the time. Now, by the time of the American Civil War and, of course, the Battle of Monocacy, the Vincentiaires are long gone. The farm has been turned over to the Trail family by that point, and they're leasing it out to the Best. That's why it's known as Best Farm today. That's the family that was here. Interestingly enough, there are no structures left out here in the distance either. All of those have since been torn down and reutilized elsewhere by the time of the war. But the main house, the secondary structure, and of course the large stone barn to the back are all relics of this earlier age of really intense slavery here on the property. And the Bests also have enslaved individuals. In fact, each of the farms that we will go to today utilize slave labor in some way during the Civil War era. Maryland will not actually do away with slavery until November of 1864. Well, that's another fascinating side note about Early's incursion in July. Maryland is actually in the process of developing a new state constitution at that very time. And there are, of course, elements within the state legislature who want to maintain slavery or to keep very repressive laws on minorities and things like that. But I think it could be argued that due to this Confederate incursion, we're actually going to see a fairly open constitution that is developed and voted on by the citizens of Maryland that would become law and the new state constitution on November 1st, 1864, that completely does away with the institution of slavery here in the state. Now, of course, unfortunately, after the Civil War, there's a lot more repressive laws and things that are then brought in, but for a few years, we had a fairly open and magnanimous state constitution here in Maryland. Just some of the interesting history that we see tying into this landscape that goes beyond the fighting. But before we move on, did anybody have any questions on this part of the field? Yes, sir.
Was the home as it sits here now pretty much the shape that it was in? I mean, not the shape.